So hi everybody, thank you very much for coming. We're excited to hear each other and learn from each other and to be able to share with you some of the excitement of the exhibit, which blew us away when we walked through it. I think I can speak for all of us. My connection with this exhibit, I guess, is that I wrote a book a while back called The Beak of the Finch that describes this extraordinary work that's been done in our lifetimes that Darwin would never have dreamed possible, to watch evolution happening in real time, like from year to year. And what makes the story dramatic is that the discovery was made in these islands, the Galapagos, Darwin's islands, using incredibly close-up patient field work looking at Darwin's finches. And the people who started that work back in 1973, Peter and Rosemary Grant, two British biologists based at McGill then and then later at Princeton, never dreamed that when they started this study, they would actually be able to see Darwin's finches evolving. But that's what they have done. And it opens up a world to think about in which life is not static, but is constantly adapting and evolving around us right now. It's not just the Galapagos. I brought just a few slides because we're each just going to speak for a few minutes and then open things up for a conversation. But one slide I often show at the end of talking about the work with Darwin's finches is a sparrow perched on a street sign that says Broadway. It's actually at my corner in Manhattan because it's going on everywhere. It's not just the Galapagos, but there are reasons why the Galapagos were ideal to help to spark Darwin's discovery of evolution by natural selection, and then for the Grants to discover how much more powerful the theory is than Darwin realized. So maybe we could go to the next slide. I'm just curious, anybody here been to this archipelago? You have to go. We were just talking about this before. It's an extraordinary place. If you go, you will not go to this island. This is off limits to tourists. It's a desert island, as you can see, called Daphne Major, the cinder cone of an extinct volcano. It is incredibly forbidding when you approach it in a little boat, which is the only way. There's only one or two little landing spots. It's steep as a roof all the way around. And the nearest bit of rock to it is Daphne Minor. So that's Daphne Major in the foreground, Daphne Minor in the back. Peter and Rosemary spent most of their careers camped on this desert island, watching Darwin's finches, documenting evolution, raising two little girls on that island, and with the help of a revolving group of grad students and postdocs, they made these amazing discoveries that have really changed the way scientists think about evolution now and study evolution now. One of those students, by the way, and cruelly it happened on his birthday, was trying to look into a finch nest in a cactus tree, stretching up to see it, fell, rolled down the slope of the volcano. You can't see it in this picture, but it's cliffs undercut by the Pacific all the way around at the bottom. Fell into the Pacific, was immediately surrounded by sharks, and had to swim halfway around the island to get to what I call in the book the welcome mat, and climb back up the cliff onto the island on his birthday. So it's a tough place to work. Would you mind going to the next slide? So those are Darwin's finches. There's actually a story in today's Times about the artist who made these drawings and others. Elizabeth Gould was her name. And I hadn't realized it, but she was an artist to rival Audubon in some ways. and she did all of the ornithological drawings for Darwin's book about the zoology of the Galapagos. So those are 4 of Darwin's finches. There are 18 species recognized today, and that's from Darwin's own scientific account of the finches, which helped lead him to his idea of evolution by natural selection, as I said. Would you mind going to the next? So this is what he says about evolution and the origin of species. This was how he looked at it, and probably how most of us just automatically think of evolution. He said, "We see nothing of these slow changes in progress until the hand of time has marked the lapse of ages." In other words, geological ages are going to have to go by before you're going to see anything remarkable in the way of change in life on Earth. And that isn't actually true, it turns out. So just to cut to the chase, this is a slide from the year when the Grants and their students made their big discovery. This was some years after they had begun. They began in 73. I think this was in 78, 79. There was a terrible drought on Daphne Major. Normally there's a rainy season and the island turns, it was stony and gray in the picture I showed you. It turns green within a few days of the rainy season starting, but the rains didn't come that year. And so those finches were under enormous pressure, in the jargon, selection pressure, and the ones that survived and made it through this awful drought and famine on Daphne Major were the ones that had the beak shape on the right-hand side there, sort of a strong parrot-like beak that allowed them to crack the last tough seeds on the island that nobody else could crack. So the finch on the left there has the beak that's typical for Geospiza fortis, the medium-beaked ground finch on Daphne. That is one of its descendants. The ones that survived, thrived, passed on their genes, had a beak that was better adapted to life on Daphne then. Doesn't look like a humongous change to us, but that degree of change carried out for 6 generations would have led to a new species of Darwin's finches. So it was a really significant change in a single year, in a single generation. Next slide, please. So when I wrote The Beak of the Finch, that kind of thing was the most dramatic story I could tell. This was back, I had met Peter and Rosemary back in 1990, and I went to visit them on Daphne Major, and it was one of the great adventures of my life to be that close to just to a new way of looking at life, looking over their shoulders. They never told me about the single most exciting discovery that they had made because they didn't want to reveal it to the world yet back in the 1990s. But in fact, they were already watching the origin of a new species of Darwin's finch on Daphne Major. It was a hybrid finch. It was the product of a medium-beaked ground finch and a cactus finch. And it was born in 1981. They'd been watching it for a decade already. And by, maybe 10 years later, they published a really important paper announcing that they had witnessed this, the origin of a new species. Could you show the next slide? So these hybrid finches, this little cluster, eat differently on Daphne Major. Here's Daphne in that green season, by the way. You can see how different it is. We're looking down into the crater. They sing their own song. They stay together in their own nesting sites. They're the blue nesting sites over there on the right. And they don't intermingle, they don't mate with the other species on the island. So if that continues for generations, we have witnessed the origin of a new species. There's much more to say about all of this, and in fact, the Grants have published many books and hundreds of technical papers about it, but it really has changed the way evolution is viewed now by scientists. And what it speaks to, I think, for all of us, is this really poignant question of how quickly can life adapt to the incredible stress and strain that we're imposing on species after species after species all over the world. There's hope in this because you do see how quickly life can evolve and respond to stress, but there are limits to how quickly life can respond still. In the next slide, I'll just mention two. So global warming, for instance, is a threat to that new species, which is called Big Bird. They nicknamed it Big Bird. It's bigger than the other Darwin's finches. Big Bird depends on cactus. Cactus depends on that dry climate that Daphne major has most of the year. Global warming, which has so far spared the Galapagos, mercifully, will not spare it forever. The world's oceans are warming, as we all know. There are upwellings that are keeping these islands cool for the time being. But when it gets wetter and hotter in the Galapagos, which are right on the equator, then the cactus will go and Big Bird will go. Next slide.
Actually, the next slide.
Oh, that's the last slide I had? All right, well, I'll just say there's one other stress that everybody's worried about right now in the Galapagos, and that is the equivalent of the pandemics that we're dealing with, which are also evolution in action, right? With all the strains that are constantly evolving from the strains before. Well, H5N1, a strain of avian flu, has been sweeping the planet. And just recently, just in September, a few dead birds were found to have died of it in the Galapagos, which is really, really scary. So again, you see this contest really between the power of evolution and adaptation and the speed with which our own species' success brings these incredible challenges to life on Earth. Okay.
Okay, so next we have some slides that Aaron provided.
We're going to actually go.
Are you going to do this first?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Can
you,
we ask questions first? Or do you want that at the end?
Why don't
We-
we go
we-
through
we-
this presentation first and we do the questions afterwards?
I'll be brief. Don't worry. I don't have any slides to show today. But you can leave the cactus up there. That's a lovely cactus. I'm an ecologist. I'm trained as an ecosystem and landscape ecologist, and there is this sort of tug of war, or this sort of interplay between what evolutionary biologists study and what ecologists study. Right? Just in the stories Jonathan was talking about, ecologists study the environment and how that creates habitat for plants and animals, right? Of course, those habitats are varying all the time, and in that way, they create the evolutionary context for these kind of changes to happen, right? Like the Grants wouldn't observe what they had if there hadn't been that drought that one year, right? That created that kind of selection pressure. And this is actually how organisms change over time, as the environment changes, right? And we're experiencing very rapid climate change, as Jonathan mentioned, but of course there's been climate change all through the history of life on Earth, all kinds of other changes as well. Sometimes those changes are relatively minor, and then we have these large extinction events, right? And there's 6 of these, and we're living in the middle of the 6th one, which depends, of course, on the changes in the environment. And then what's different, of course, about our evolutionary environment is that we're creating it. We're creating it for these other species. So through habitat destruction and through pollution and through climate change and so forth. And if those conditions continue, of course, that'll lead to this 6th extinction event, which could be as bad as some of the others in the past. although no one knows, right? And the kind of thing, as a sort of historian, the thing I think about is that, we live in a time of such rapid change. All of us have grown up in a period of such rapid change. Unlike actually really any other generation, except maybe the one right before a human generation on Earth, which didn't see it as fast as we did, and probably not as fast as our kids are going to see. Like, we live in a time of just really dramatic changes. There was about 5 billion people on the face of the planet when I was born, and now there's 8 billion going on 9 billion people, right? No human generation has ever seen a change like that. And so, my work in conservation, I started out because, of course, I love the environment and I love ecology and I love, studying in wild places like this. But I've come around to realizing that the most important thing about conservation is actually the ideas that are in people's minds, right? Because we are the selection pressure in some sense. We are the randomization event that all these other species are having to respond to. And so I thought maybe I'd just say at the beginning that, there is this sort of parallel field to evolution, which is about memetics and the idea of how ideas are evolving, right? Darwin's, big idea was that, he observed that there was variation in populations, like not, if you pick finches, they're not all quite the same. There's a little bit of variation between them. Darwin noticed that variation is heritable to their children, although he didn't really understand the mechanism how. He didn't really understand about DNA and things, but it was heritable. And then he observed that if not everybody gets through, if not everybody reproduces from one generation to the next, there's going to be changes, right? Whether that's through selection, like we were just talking about, or even through just random changes about who ends up having kids and most kids that come through. And it's also true for ideas, right? So ideas are being generated all the time by all of us, right? And then they're going through, there's some sort of natural variation process. I might have an idea and I might tell Aaron or I might tell Jonathan and I might tell somebody else. It's going to vary a little bit every time it gets told. Some ideas, they'll decide like, that was a bad idea, so I'm just not going to mention it, And then those ideas die away. And then other ideas are like, well, that's an interesting idea, like the Grant's idea, or Darwin's idea, or, I like to think, my idea about what Manhattan was like right before, Europeans got there. That's another one of those kind of sticky ideas. And the more we talk about those ideas, the more those ideas filter in our brains. And then the last thing to say about that is, of course, every species has its way of living, its life history, we call them in ecology. So, these birds, they eat seeds, and so it matters whether they can break the seed or not. So that becomes the evolutionary mechanism for them. What's our particular life history characteristic? What's our trick? How do we succeed? And I would say it's really two things. It's A, our ability to imagine the past and imagine a future, to actually conceptualize beyond our own time and our own place, to have sympathy and empathy for other people and for other species and so forth, and our ability to talk about it, to actually generate these ideas and have a promotional process that then memetics can work on. And this is really our challenge of our time, is to be telling compelling stories about what it means to be a human being on planet Earth, shaping the environment for everything else.
Thank you.
So let's go on to Aaron real quick, and then after that we'll just have some questions and discussion. I know that you already had a question.
Preservationists and naturalists. And so, again, my name is Aaron Mair, and I'm the Wilderness Campaign Director for the Adirondack Council. And I'm a retired, in true confession, I'm a retired epidemiologist from the New York State Department of Health, from the Bureau of Chronic Disease Evaluation and Research. And instead of retiring and staying in that field or lecturing, etc., I went over to follow the passion side because of the current climate crisis, or as they say, that's the driver of the potential sixth great extinction. And the urgency and the crisis of now really said, what are the things that can bend the needle toward reducing the impact of climate? And one is natural base, or we can talk about man-made base right now. We're talking about investing in carbon capture storage, where we invest in technology and man-made technology, so-called get us out of this man-made crisis. But one of the things is that nature actually has evolved 4.5 billion years, has developed systems to sequester carbon. And one of those systems, those ecosystems, are wilderness. And I work in the Adirondacks, and the Adirondacks at over 6 million acres. It is the largest carbon sequestration engine in the lower 48 states. It is the largest wilderness ecosystem in the lower 48, and it also contains the nation's largest old-growth forest on this side of the hemisphere. And I'll actually be leading a tour with a couple of mycologists in the field there. So the urgency is not worrying about COVID or the next viral outbreaks. It are also driven by anthropogenic acts. Mine right now is the crisis that we have to act within the next 6 years in pushing solutions that are proven, that are knowable, and advancing them, and lifting up the voice. Because right now there still are logging parts of the Adirondacks for wood-based fuels for pelletization, because they said that wood pellets are carbon neutral, and actually burning forests or burning trees is a carbon neutral. So I'm actually pushing it back against that. Next slide, please. So part of expanding that analysis is getting people and getting our nation to understand the significance of carbon sequestration. That's me in the old growth forests there. Again, looking at the whole ecosystem side of it, and how trees, not only trees, but the soils, the fungi, all of the things symbiotic. When we talk about nature and evolution, these things are not just the spot evolution, but it's the evolution in the wake of a dialectical process or connected process of flora and fauna. And it's right now we have two big COPs. One is the COP on Council of Parties. It's a UN-based effort to protect biodiversity. So we have COPs on biodiversity, but also COPs on climate. But they go hand in hand. And so looking at biodiversity and as a critical component of wilderness health that also drives the health of trees is one of the things that I pull people, and that's a Teddy Roosevelt reenactor at the location. And Teddy, remember Teddy Roosevelt was pretty much a significant naturalist in his day, called the quasi-Darwin, quasi-Victorianist naturalist, but a very critical force in protecting wilderness ecosystems nationwide, our national parks. Again, it was his imprimatur, his fingerprint. They were preserving nature for nature's sake, not because of a prospective tilt toward our impact on humanity. So they felt that if they preserved these little postage stamps nationwide, our national park system, that we would somehow maintain and preserve in static, what level of biodiversity we had, and you try to advance that. But now we come to a stage with the science, and this is the other piece, because one of the things that Darwin did not factor in was the knowledge behind the discovery of the DNA. Also, the current other sciences that also drive, as I said, the whole biomes and ecosystems that drive and put pressure on species to evolve and to adapt. We're no longer operating in Earth time, or as I say, but we're advancing right now in the human epoch, or human-driven force, which is really, really globally significant. Next slide, please. And so one of the things, boy, that thing moved around, didn't it? But so thank goodness I have my little note of Peter Wallace's piece. And I found this really, really stunning. So when we talk about, as science is advancing, one of the key punchlines, and I hope you all read this work, and there's also a documentary out, and I did a talk at UMass Amherst on this particular piece. And, we don't think of trees as talking, and in fact you get Treebeard in The Lord of the Rings. And lo and behold, Peter Wallace absolutely did a pioneering study, and they show how the interconnection of trees, forests, soils, but also fungi and the mycelial networks, and how trees can communicate and control the growth and population of and thickness and density of forests of various species within the forest. But the most powerful thing is not only looking at trees in isolation, but looking at the whole ecosystem. And what drives the conditions of the soil, this is the fauna, the animals, and their life cycles also contributing. You mentioned the big drought and its impact upon the finches. But also, again, the growth cycles that are just underlying just within the soil. As drought may hit, things may dry up, but for some reason when water comes by, all of a sudden, poof, it's green again, but not necessarily the same. But what's really powerful about the hidden life of trees, it gives us a very powerful window into not only the complexity of nature, but what a gift we have that we can, as part of our Anthropocene footprint, take advantage of. Folks just think that we would just go plant 1,000 trees and that's sufficient enough. What this thesis here pushed forward is that you need to do more than that. A, preserving what you have, but are the soils healthy? The trees do have a means of communicating, and they've actually monitored the signals that send when the trees are in distress or threat, they feel. And so our science has got to the level and the point where our understanding of nature and ecology is very, very profound. And this, from the point of those of us who are trying to preserve wilderness carbon sinks, we learn even much more than it's just planting up trees, but protecting the massive wilderness ecosystems, whether it is the Amazon, whether it is sub-Saharan West Africa, or the Pacific Islands, of Indonesia. These ecosystems are right now the proverbial lungs of the planet, and they are all under stress. And in fact, the Amazon is at a tipping point where it's actually now emitting more carbon than it is actually sequestering. And the piece in driving this, and again, I was just very, very touched by this exhibit here, because it pulls in through an artist's interpretation, not only what we thread at risk in losing, but how these things, the web of life, how these things are very connected, but more importantly, driving home very, very powerful scientific points that, again, through an artist's eye, that just takes us another way of reinterpreting. Look at the next slide, please. And so it's not only just old folks in the woods, but taking another generation. And we created the Timbuktu Summer Science Program, which I brought about 80 youth through 3 sessions of classes into the Adirondacks as part of a summer science career, but learning the career paths within the environmental sciences and ecological sciences, biology, et cetera. Because again, taking kids from urban centers, the image that I'm going to the exhibit is that there's this wonderful painting of the built Metro New York City environment and the window of the Freedom Tower going up, but on the table are cutouts and images and figurines of various flora and fauna, animals that are there. And so you can kind of see that built environment that we've come to rely upon in the world, or the greater world of our biodiverse world, is now reduced to figurines and cutout images. And what we talk about the next mass extinction, what we stand to lose. In fact, some of those species are threatened at risk right now. But getting that and communicating that message not only to youth and as I say, and other folks, but how precious and how under threat these spaces are. And this is one of the things advancing this, but also, being kind of subversive and pushing the need for us to protect this space. So the president in the White House has announced the 30 by 30, which is the first presidential announcement of policy and executive order to protect the 30% of our nation's wilderness by 2030. I'm obviously bullish on protecting more. And it's the first time ever as a climate solution. So being an advocate and passionate in this space is really, really critical, because when we talk about the 6th great extinction, it's not only preserving and recording and being part of what is already here, but how it is right now essential for our survival as we start to try to get rid of and push down and tamp down fossil fuels. Next slide, please. So we talk about the piece when we talk about the evolution, and again, one of the big fanboys of Darwin was Joseph LeConte. Joseph LeConte, everybody probably heard of John Muir. I was the 57th John Muir. And John Muir and Joe LeConte founded the Sierra Club. And they could have not been any more different. One was into the Darwinistic evolution, survival of the fittest of the species, but one was so tired of humankind that he wanted to preserve nature, saying nature is better off without humankind. That was the extreme of John Muir. In fact, he did his 1,000-mile march in 1867 with Henry Thoreau's works in his pockets. And people always talk about him. And everybody gets caught up in the nature and the story and the narrative in that walk, but what was really critical, putting on my history hat, 1867 is 2 years after the Civil War. And a lot of folks lose sight of that. And there was a reason why he did that walk through the South, was to see the wholesale industrialized destruction that had never been seen at that time. And he also was a draft dodger. He and his brother. So he's now walking through the South and looking at the impact. Not only he's living it, at that time, the impact on humanity, man's cruelty to mankind, slavery, and then now blacks are free, but he's now walking through a burnt-out South, and he's being bombarded with questions by former Confederates. And he kept telling them, he goes, "Look, I'm a naturalist, and I'm here looking at flora and fauna. I'm not really getting into whether blacks should have rights." This is, 1867, they're talking about the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. He says, "I'm not here getting into that." But he did make his journey through it. In fact, one of the things in that 1,000-mile journey, he mentions the word Sambo in describing one of the African-American households that he stayed at in his journey, and that has been leveraged. Today, you'll see the big taking down monuments as John Muir was anti-African American because of that statement. This is one of those bad cases of how modern sensibilities and awareness, we try to project it upon the past and come up with, well, he must have been racist, which is totally nonsense. Because if you read the whole piece, I tell people he does make a racist comment in there, but considering Samuel Clemens or Mark Twain, who was a peer at that time, there's I said Huck Finn and the song that's out there, they got N-words on just about every other paragraph. But I said where he does make that slip, and it's not, you got to understand the vernacular time. He's riding behind a boy that was actually helping him ford a river, and he was describing the kid in front of him on how large the horse was and the little nig riding him, and he just said little nig, and so we all know what that's a short for. But everybody misses that, and they fixate on the Sambo. And I said, I had to end up writing an article in defense of John Muir, and it was published in the Earth Island Journal on his analysis of the treatment of African Americans and indigenous people, and how many folks and critics of them actually misread his writings and his pieces. And the reason why he said Sambo was not because of pejoratives. It really is not until the 1930s. And again, we talk about literature, conveying when ideas are going. Little Black Sambo is a book that was written, child books written in the 30s, and that term then became that racist term. But at that particular point in time, and him being, using the science of naturalists at the time, which was driving the census. If you ever pulled an 1860 census, 1880, 1870 census, and you look at the classification of blacks, you had octoroon, quadroon, mulatto, black, and then very black is Sambo. And so he, being a naturalist, and if you're following, as he's even explained to Confederates who he was using an ethnographic classification rather than a slur. And this is an example of how people trying to look at 19th and early 20th century literature and trying to inject today's political use of terms can end up. But Joe LeConte, on the other hand, unlike Muir, was a rabid racist. And he was a eugenicist and a naturalist, and he goes right to the early, what I call pillars of naturalism, like our Museum of Natural History, where the displaying and exhibits of people and species were in the Darwinistic sense of survival of the fittest. And he had a polygenetic view of even mankind, going from the superior Anglo-Saxon on down to the inferior African or Negroid individual. And there was exhibits at the Museum of Natural History. You know, these were big things. This is like part of putting in showcasing these things, not until after World War II, where you found that his works inspired the likes of Hitler, and you saw the dangers and the pathology of naturalism, that you all of a sudden see these aspects of the human class stripped out of these museums and these exhibits. And so they moved into modifying their history. But the thing is, when we talk about the impacts of natural selection, again, really going back to your point, when we look at human migration out of Africa to different parts of the globe, thanks to DNA, we could absolutely see through just the endogamy of breeding in certain areas and regions and the harshness and the impacts of the environment on our adaptation, just like the beaks of the finches. That is the driver. It's not an issue of mental and superior. So imparting, knowledge and other things and race on it, you get to the issue of what drives, scientific interpretation. Well, the bad part of naturalism is that when it props up bad ideology or, as I say, themes of power, humankind is known to use the Darwinistic lens to try to elevate and support, in this case, in naturalists like Joe LeConte, who's a former Confederate soldier, racism and white supremacy. In fact, he has a whole tome of books around that, again, the natural order of things, and again, not only order of things, but even amongst humanities. And he was vociferous against granting African Americans in the 19th century, their rights of equality, and he advocated passionately, and he tried to use Darwinistic, naturalist, but tends to, as I say, we now have scientific evidence that blacks are inferior. But, again, cloaked within leveraging other evolution, other species as backing up the argument, but really it was not an argument anchored in science, as an argument anchored in the superstition and superiority of one man over another man, and the hegemony and dominance. And we still see that chauvinism and that dominance to this day. And that's why I love this exhibit, because, again, the need for humanity, to classify things, the taxonomy debate, and there's a treat of a exhibit there that has the taxonomy, and it lays out it in very eloquent terms. And again, our classification is secondary to the natural, ecological, and geological forces that are around us. But the thing that is of us, the anthropogenic footprint, and that impact upon species is really, really the powerful driver. And I have Louis Agassiz, because Agassiz was a mentor of Joe LeConte, and they really came together, and they actually did field work in the Helderberg Mountains, which is, I live within the shadow of the Helderberg Mountains in Adirondack, not the Adirondacks, up by Albany. And that's where you'll find, if you look at some Agassiz's work in the Helderberg Mountains and the Helderberg Escarpments, a lot of it are rich record of fossils, etc. Of, again, that anywhere you trip, you kick up a fossil. But again, he was also very much an ardent Darwinist, and he would, again, it was not only just for the science of the field, but also their use of it to advance the white Anglo-Saxon hegemony over our civil society and over education, over science. And it's, a very, very, very powerful. But again, the arc of me sitting in John Muir's shoes versus LeConte's shoes shows you how the movement itself has changed. And so Muir does win out in his love of nature, and his imprint, as they say, on an organization like the Sierra Club. And Joe LeConte is one of the people, as they say, I was proud during my presidency to literally pull down anything that really gave monument and credence. And there was a lot of pushback because, well, he did all this other great science. He's a pioneering professor in the geology department at UC Berkeley. I go, yes, but for this particular end. And we have to be mindful, we're not throwing out the science, but throwing out the character and then the thesis that he was pushing in advance of his professorship at the geology department at UC Berkeley. But what's critical then and now is, and the projection of then and now, is the power of humanity to interpretate, classify, but also use that classification power to drive civil society and human footprint, then to the same fact that we talk about our species now driving the environment, the ecology, the planet's impact upon nature, and that we now stand at the precipice of us being a generation who will have more access to flora and fauna and diverse nature than the next generations of our children and grandchildren, and the urgency of the need to act. So I was touched by many pieces there, that you all must take and avail yourselves of it, that speak to not only this rich conversation, and this conversation is obviously it's been ongoing, but how even science has evolved that has now yielded us to come up with much more meaningful interpretations, but more importantly, hopefully urging us to act in this Anthropocene era. Thank you.